So here we go as we continue to look at World War I, and we're asking how important were the other fronts in the war? This is part two of this, and this is looking at why did the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915 fail? Again, so why did the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915 fail? A lot of things to consider. The First thing to consider is the geography of the Turkish Straits. A strait is a narrow passage connecting two bodies of water. The Dardanelles and the Bosphorus are known as the Turkish Straits. They connect the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. That is, they connect the rest of Europe to the countries that border the Black Sea. So, the Turkish Straits have always been and continue to be strategically important in Europe because they are the means that most ship and trade move between countries that border the Black Sea, like Russia, and the rest of the world. Therefore, they were important in the fighting of World War I. Both the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles are extremely narrow, and Istanbul sits on both the European and Asian sides of the Bosphorus. So being able to control the city of Istanbul, as well as these two straits, is going to be very important. So the first thing to consider is why Gallipoli itself, right? Now, there were a number of reasons why we're going to consider Gallipoli. First, given the stalemate on the Western Front and they were bogged down in trenches, the inability to gain a sort of victory over the Germans, and the failure of the Battle of the Marne and heavy casualties from the Battle of Ypres, both the British and the French were looking to open another theater in order to draw the pressure off of the Western Front, help split up German forces. And possibly they would gain a decisive victory that could change the course of the war, especially since the Ottomans were thought of as the sick man of Europe, and they were believed to be so weak that they could have a relatively painless and a decisive victory. This would provide a boost in morale, and then this win would then therefore change the course of the war. Getting control over the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus would open access to the Black Sea and help out the Russians. Now, once the Ottomans joined the war, they closed off access to the Black Sea, and this resulted in a 90% reduction in Russian trade. By gaining control over this area, the Allies would be able to continue to supply Russia and keep Russia fighting the war. Another thing was to open access attacking the Austro-Hungarians through the Balkans. So it would open up another point where the Central Powers would have to be fighting. In the beginning, so the decision was made to open up another front in the war by capturing and controlling the Straits of Turkey. The first step to do this was to capture the forts along the straits and Istanbul with naval bombardment. However, this was a complete failure. Too many ships were being damaged by the mines laid in the straits, as well as shell fire from the forts. So all along the straits, you had forts obviously protecting them. And so because the naval bombardment didn't work, they decided to go for an amphibious land invasion instead. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops launched an invasion of Turkey on April 25, 1915. The goal was to have a clear and outright victory since the Western Front was mired in trench warfare and there was little movement. And as we'll see later on, after some initial victories, Russia was not faring well in the war and was fighting the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottomans. So the idea was to give assistance to the Russian allies. And this was chosen because, as we stated, previous attempts to knock out the guns at Gallipoli had failed because of a combination of bad weather, the mines in the Dardanelles, and the command of a German general called von Sanders. The combined forces at Gallipoli were commanded by a British Sir Ian Hamilton. Now, they were given some advice. The Greeks were like, dude, Hamilton, you're going to need 150,000 soldiers if you want to take Gallipoli. But, in Greek. Unfortunately, Lord Kirchner, who is the head of the British Armed Forces, didn't really like the plan. And so he was like, you know what? Here's the thing. I know you want 150,000, but I'm going to give you half of that. Go do it. And so there you go. After the March naval raids that we spoke about, the Ottomans knew that the Allied forces were coming. Hamilton had lost the element of surprise, and so the Ottomans sent an additional 70,000 soldiers to defend the peninsula. So, let's recap. Hamilton had half the men he needed, he lost the element of surprise, and he was facing a well-commanded Ottoman troop that had just been supplemented by the same number of soldiers that he had. You know what? Things aren't looking so hot. There was also a massive lack of information. According to historian Michael Hickey, there was a lack of up-to-date knowledge about Turkish troop positions. Hamilton's only intelligence consisted of a 1912 manual of the Turkish army, some old and inaccurate maps, a tourist guide. That's right, y'all. The man went to war with a tourist guide from Egypt, and whatever little bit of information he could find from the Turkish desk at the Foreign Office. Y'all, things are about to go to heck in a handbasket. With the first landing on April 25th, 1915, they tried to establish two bridgeheads, one at Helles in the north and the other at Kabatepe in the south. The red on the map shows the maximum area controlled by the Allied troops, and the green shows the movement of Ottoman troops. Now, the British at Helles experienced heavy casualties, with 20,000 of the 70,000 invading force killed or wounded. Turkish machine gunners had a direct line of fire to where they landed on the beach. And of course, this is going to mean a lot of people gotten killed. Hamilton was commanding offshore, miles away from the landing, and therefore he couldn't fully understand the issues that were being faced at the landing site, and he also couldn't make any changes. And to the north in Kabatepe, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, that is the Anzac troops, were dropped 1.5 kilometers away from the designated point. Therefore, they faced heavy, steep cliffs, and this prevented the Anzac troops from making their way inland. And as you can see from this painting by George Lambert showing the landing at Anzac Cove, you can see that they had an uphill climb to try to capture the land area, and thereby limiting their effectiveness. The conditions in Gallipoli were difficult for all because there were high summer temperatures. And this was especially difficult for people to work in because the combined Allied forces were unused to them. There was also a shortage of fresh water. There were flies in the food, and this was especially bad because the flies would land on dead bodies and then go back to the food, and this would be transferring diseases. The bodies of the dead soldiers couldn't be buried, so they basically were decomposing and rotting in place. Again, you have diseases spreading. And once winter came, it brought no relief because there were heavy rains. And these heavy rains led to flooding that sometimes that flooding was so heavy that men were literally washed out to sea. And then, of course, you also have snow. And this meant that the soldiers had to deal with the dangers of frostbite. Hamilton was unable to move off of the beach either in the north or the south of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Therefore, they planned a second invasion on August 6th at Sulva Bay. The idea was that the Anzac forces would create a diversion at Anzac Cove to the north at Kabatepe to draw the attention of the Ottomans, and then 20,000 British troops under the command of General Stopford would be able to come ashore at Suvla Bay. There they would find very little opposition. Now, General Stopford, in keeping with his name, stopped. He was unwilling to push inland. This meant that the Ottomans had more time to respond to this aspect of the invasion, and they sent more troops to defend Suvla, and the result was stalemate, just as with the other landings. By the time we get to October, as he had made no headway in the battle that was desperately needed to be a clear and overwhelming victory, General Hamilton was replaced by General Monroe. Now, Monroe got there, he saw that there was little chance of success at Gallipoli, especially given that Bulgaria has now entered the war as a central power and facing the horrific winter conditions. General Monroe decides to withdraw the Allied troops from Gallipoli in November 1915. Given all of the stuff that we'd spoken about in terms of the goals of the war, we need to also consider the impacts of Gallipoli. Gallipoli was another massive failure in World War I, and it was a humiliating defeat, especially since the Ottomans had been seen as an easily defeated opponent. 1 million men were involved from both sides. The Allied troops had 300,000 casualties, and the Ottomans had another 250,000. Now, as we said previously, this was an attempt to search for an alternative front in the war, as they had been bogged down by trench warfare on the Western Front. And remember that by the time Gallipoli was launched in April, France's Plan 17 had failed, the First Battle of the Marne had failed, the race to the sea had ended in stalemate and a trench war of attrition. The failure of Gallipoli to make headway into the Ottoman forces meant that the search for an alternative to the war of attrition in Belgium and France was over. There were also political casualties. Winston Churchill resigned from the government as he had been one of the sponsors of the idea. He had been real gung-ho for this. And in December, Asquith is replaced as prime minister by David Lloyd George. So, we've reached the end, my friends, and that means that we need to address the whole question of the video, that is, why the Gallipoli campaign failed. So, in order to do so, explain the role of the following in the failure of the Gallipoli campaign: poor leadership, the Turkish defenses, and the conditions facing the men at Gallipoli. And hold on, I have a surprise for you. And here is your surprise. So, why don't skeletons fight each other? I know. Think hard, Dot. Do. Because they don't have the guts. You're welcome.